And we are back. Welcome back to the Luke Deckard Show. I am your host, Luke Deckard. For those who don't know, I'm a novelist and a scriptwriter. And tonight we have Mathew Booth with us, who is also a crime fiction novelist and all-around dude. Welcome.
That's the first time I've been called one of those, Luke.
Well, being American, I pretty much call everybody dude.
That's fair enough.
That is my go-to. Everyone is a dude. But yeah. So how are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Good.
How are you? Thanks for having me along to talk about what I think is a mutually favourite topic.
Yes. Tonight is all about noir fiction, or rather film noir. But they blend together. So I think it's going to be impossible to not discuss, the writers, the pulp writers who kind of gave us film noir, gave us the ingredients to have this genre come into being. But let's see, we got Biffer is in the chat. Hello, Biffer. Yeah, good to see you, buddy. Hope you're well. So I think this is going to be a lot of fun. So we picked a lot of really fun films to watch for this particular episode. So I think before we get into the films that we watched, the general kind of question I think that we have for the night is what makes film noir so great. So my first question for you, Mathew, would be, what was it that sparked your interest in film noir?
Well, it's interesting that you say we might not be able to separate the literary side from the cinematic side, because I actually came to film noir through the literature of it, particularly Raymond Chandler. A lot of my interests have all stemmed really from an initial interest at about, 10 or 11 with Sherlock Holmes. And Holmes opened up a lot of doors to me, both in terms of a writer and in terms of a reader.
Yes.
And I don't think it's a very giant leap to go from Sherlock Holmes to Philip Marlowe, I have to say. I think that's less of a leap than to go from Holmes to something like Hercule Poirot.
I agree.
I think Holmes has a lot more in common with the American style of crime writing than he does with tea and muffins and a body in the library sort of thing.
Yes.
So I came to film noir from Raymond Chandler. I'm not sure whether the first film noir I saw was a Philip Marlowe film, but I suspect it probably wasn't, because I suspect it was the Maltese Falcon.
Right.
And it was just a bit like just crime fiction generally. Once I'd seen one, I thought, God, that was good.
Yes.
What else is in this sort of type of film? And then that leads you on to things like The Big Sleep and Double Indemnity and some of the films that we'll be talking about, I hope, in this discussion. But so that's what's kickstarted my interest in it. And the ones I favour tend to be adaptations of favourite novels,
Yes.
But there are certain film noir that entries into the film noir canon which are purely cinema, and we'll touch on some of those, I think. But and it was, what I liked about it was that it was so that it was absolutely of its own. It didn't seem to be connected to anything else. I tend to say it's not a genre of film. I think the genre is crime. I think it's a style. I think it's a mood, rather than a sort of particular genre of cinema. But there's nothing quite like it. There's nothing really that captures that real sense of black and white and dread. And the way it's shot. It just looks great. The stories are great. There's a lot to think about The characters are great. Generally speaking, the actors that are cast in them, that they're almost like a film noir repertory company.
Yeah,
They're universally good, and
yes,
it's just all round satisfying stuff.
yeah, yeah. I totally agree. I think I agree with your point that kind of Sherlock Holmes is an easy stepping stone to go from Holmes to kind of Philip Marlowe and Sam Spade and all those characters. I actually wrote an essay a couple of years ago about this. That's sort of there are a lot of hard boiled ingredients in the Sherlock Holmes canon.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you can quite easily see that how that translates more into those novels than it does with the Agatha Christie's and the Dorothy Sayers and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, so Holmes was definitely, like you, kind of my stepping stone as well. I was as a kid, I read some Sherlock Holmes and things like that, but I didn't really get into crime fiction until I was in my 20s. And I was looking for something, I loved Holmes, but I was looking for something that packed a little bit more of a punch. And then that's when I, finally read, I think the first noir novel that I remember reading, at least, was The Glass Key. That was my first introduction, and then from there it was, Philip Marlowe and obviously some of the rest of Dashiell Hammett's work as well. And once I kind of cracked that, I opened up that Pandora's box of hard-boiled fiction. I didn't look back.
Yeah, absolutely.
It resonated with me in such a way that it resonated with me in a way more than Golden Age fiction was doing for me at the time, and in a way that, in some ways, modern fiction wasn't resonating with me. There's just something about it that just is great and timeless, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, I am a big fan, an advocate of the Golden Age.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But that's, again, of its type. And
yes.
That's its own thing.
Yes.
There's much more of a correlation between those Holmes stories and there are with Philip Marlowe. I mean, to put it in its simplest terms, if you substitute the PI's shabby office for the Baker Street sitting room,
yes,
you have the detective's den where a client comes. He has clients.
Absolutely.
They give him a problem that he goes on to solve.
Yes.
Sometimes with a gun and a fist, and sometimes with his brain. And that's Chandler all over. It's just that, Doyle doesn't do the similes. So I do remember, I might not remember the first film noir film, but I do remember my first hard-boiled crime, and it was The Lady in the Lake. And I think I read it in a sitting.
Mm-hmm.
I could not put that down.
What was it?
The Lady in the Lake. Raymond Chandler's The Lady in the Lake. And because I knew about that sort of style of writing because it had been parodied and I'd seen it parodied. But I was blown away by the real thing. And I thought, this is a writer like no other you've come across. Just his, again, what we said about film, right? His mood and his style overrides everything else.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the best adaptations of his books capture that in some way.
Absolutely.
They capture that first person, aggressive, active voice that Chandler had, in various cinematic ways. Yeah. Yeah. I find it like it's like a roller coaster. Once you're on it, you sort of don't want to get off it, And
yeah, totally.
It doesn't really matter if you don't understand the plot. I mean, I don't think anybody understands The Big Sleep, for example. Famously, nobody understands The Big Sleep. But it doesn't. By the end credits and the last page of the book, it doesn't really matter. I don't think. Whereas if you don't understand a Golden Age detective story, the whole thing has failed.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's what is so great again about Chandler is and with hard-boiled fiction is it is very much not plot focused. It is more about character and character interaction and the character drama. It's not about the intricate sort of puzzle mystery, how you get from, the kind of, the poison dart has to shoot at just the right time to hit the guy in the neck, and then it needs to fall down the grate so he can, all that kind of stuff. Hard-boiled stuff doesn't really do that. It's in some ways simplifies the mystery, and just effectively, I can't remember who said it, but there was someone once who kind of described it as sort of just shaking up. You kind of enter the scene and you just sort of shake up the status quo to kind of see what happens. See what falls. And that's kind of what the hard-boiled detective is doing. He or she is entering these arenas, and they don't really know what they don't always know what they're looking for or who they're looking for. So they just go in and start shaking stuff up. And then as a result of that, follow trails. And sometimes these trails, have really nothing to do with what the initial kind of job was, and suddenly they're solving some other mystery that has nothing to do with kind of, that initial thing. I think that, which is very, very different to your typical Sherlock Holmes, Agatha Christie stuff, where it's very, you are focused on this particular cast of people, this particular crime, and everything is just...
So certainly in Agatha Christie you are, certainly, and in any golden age detective story, really. But that's a point you made there is one of the things I love about hard-boiled crime novels, which, and particularly private eye novels, where they might be asked to, I don't know, find a missing girl, or to see if a husband is cheating.
Yeah.
And that's quite it starts off quite as a small pedestrian type investigation. But by the end of it, it's uncovered God knows what political intrigue and all the rest of it, So it starts little and always mushrooms out. And the PI novels and films that do that, I find really satisfying. Really, really satisfying. And I think the genesis of that is in Chandler, actually, because he famously he didn't plot to such an extent that his novels are very often 2 or 3, maybe even 4 short stories. Just sort of, he called it cannibalization. They just stuck together with a bit of very flimsy thread.
Yes.
And you can sometimes see the join, but it never really matters.
Yes, correct.
Really
I completely agree with that. I mean, that was... Chandler was... The hard-boiled fiction is I'm currently working on a coming to the end of a PhD in crime fiction, and my whole focus has been hard-boiled fiction. And so the novel that I've written for this PhD is it's very much in that vein. There's probably a slightly more coherent plot line than what you might get with Chandler, but there is still that sense of sort of looseness, and it isn't so much the plot of detective needs to find X or needs to solve X or whatnot, as much as it is detective enters this room and what happens as a result of him being in this room. What does him entering this room mean for him, and how does it raise the stakes of his personal life and personal drama? And I think you get that quite a bit with Chandler.
I think he famously said, I think, that a private eye is a catalyst.
Yeah, absolutely.
To make other things happen.
Yes.
Which is why Marlowe is very much I think that's part of the reason he's a first person narrator, because it's the other people around him that matter more than he does. Yeah. It's just that he tells you about those people in such an elaborate but seductive way.
Yes.
You are carried along with it, and you don't realize until the end that maybe that didn't make a great deal of sense.
No kidding.
I mean, my favorite is The Long Goodbye. That's my favorite Chandler novel is The Long Goodbye.
Oh, right, yes.
Controversial in some quarters, but that is even more incoherent because he was half drunk when he wrote it. So and it's about a drunk trying to make sense of being a drunk.
Yes.
So in that respect, it's very, very fascinating to learn about him.
Yes.
But it's the mystery. I'm not even sure I could tell you right now who's done it or done what.
Terry Lennox did some stuff.
Yes, that's right. Terry Lennox did some stuff, and then needed a lift to Mexico. And after that, I'm sort of just going along with it, But it's an unputdownable book. It's fascinating. It's fascinating.
Yeah. I remember when my first read of The Long Goodbye, and I was, I don't know how many pages in, because it is a big one. I have it behind me. It's for a Chandler. This is thick, because it's about 400. It's over 400 pages. Close to 450.
Yeah.
I was probably around 300, and I was like, this sucker could end right now, and that would be fine with me. But at the same time, like you said, there is something so gripping just about Marlowe's journey.
It's a character piece. It's a character piece about him and the world he lives in, which is the world in that book more than any other, I think, or maybe The Little Sister. It is the film noir world, The Little Sister being about the Hollywood process after Chandler's bad experience writing things like the screenplays for Double Indemnity and the Blue Dahlia and things like that. Famously didn't like it. Nor did Billy Wilder, I don't think. But you can see he's just venting some of his anger, and then in The Little Sister, and then in The Long Goodbye, he's sort of being a bit more introspective. His wife's just dying. Ian Rankin once said that he used Rebus as a punch bag at certain points of his life. And I think that's what Chandler does with Marlowe in The Long Goodbye. I think he takes all of his frustrations and doubts and foibles and weaknesses and gets them out of his, it's almost cathartic. It's like a cathartic novel dressed as a detective story. It's a magnificent work. I think anyone that's interested in crime fiction should read it and try and get past page 300 and whatever you said.
Yes, it's true. And what fascinates me as well is the sort of, I think there is I do sort of at times worry about the kind of the future of crime fiction as well. And there have been many times throughout my literary career in which I have met individuals who work within the industry, who work within publishing, who, when you mention a name like Raymond Chandler, and I should also clarify this, who work not just within publishing but within crime fiction, and you mention the name Raymond Chandler, and they just give you a blank stare, and then they follow that up with who, and then I'm like, oh my god,
that's incredible. That's incredible.
And it has happened a number of times, and so there were moments where I worry. I'm like, are we, as time moves on, are we? I hope that we're not losing touch of the greatness that because really crime fiction as we have it today wouldn't really exist, in my opinion, without the noir guys and gals. Golden Age is great, and I love a lot of Golden Age stuff, but it doesn't really get us to the point where we are today. You don't really have Rebus without Chandler.
Not at all. Absolutely not. And there's a reason why the Rebus books and the Laidlaw books, which were an inspiration on the Rebus books, they're called Tartan Noir for a reason.
Yes.
What I'd say about Golden Age is that it's still relevant. It seems to me that because it is so cozy, for want of a better word, because everything is wrapped up in the end.
Yes.
You know who's done it and you know why, and that they're going to go to prison or be hanged or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
There's something comforting. So after the First World War, that sort of restoring order was of vital importance and very comforting.
Absolutely.
after the Second World War, the same.
Yes.
And
but only in Britain.
But only in Britain. And my golden age novels came about just as the pandemic hit.
Mm.
And I part of me wonders whether there's a resurge of golden age fiction at the minute.
There is.
It seems to me that if you did a graph where golden age is at its highest, it's in times of national worry or concern or something like that.
Yeah.
Whereas ironically, I suppose, because film noir and the noir writers are much more hard hitting, I bet if you did the same graph, they'd be on a constant, because they've always got something to say.
Yes.
They've always got something that is relevant, because they try and show the world as it is.
Yeah. Because when you think about it, golden age stuff more or less petered off. We don't really have golden age writers today. We have a few. It's not. I'm not complete blanket, but in terms of the power of the golden age, we don't have that sort of star power anymore in terms of that kind of fiction. We have sporadic little fun mysteries, and cozy is still very big, but when you think about the hard-boiled stuff, I mean, every decade from the 1920s onwards, there are at least 2 to 3 major writers per decade. You have Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler. You have Ross MacDonald. You have Mickey Spillane. You have Robert B. Parker, Sarah Pretsky. Walter Mosley.
Absolutely.
People that it just keeps coming because it as you say, it's the way that it's sort of constant as a commentary. But it's also funny that you say that about Golden Age and the pandemic, because I remember kind of getting a much more nuanced sense of why there was so much Golden Age fiction after the first 2 world wars. It actually made way more sense to me, because there were people who were during the pandemic trying to come out with pandemic novels, and people were like, "Oh, come on, no." And I was like, you know what? I get it. I get it in a way I didn't really understand it before, because it's like, sometimes not all of your fiction needs to be gruff and depressing.
No, absolutely. I'd agree. And I mean, sometimes the noir world is artificial. I mean, a private detective is not Philip Marlowe, and the real world is not Philip Marlowe.
Of course not. No.
But the Golden Age is, and we'll move on from the Golden Age perhaps, but the Golden Age is absolutely typified by its artificial construct.
Yeah.
You're entering into a contract with a Golden Age writer that says this is not the real world.
Yes.
It might well look like your real world, but in your real world, you don't have somebody who's been stabbed with an elaborate knife in a locked room where there's no key and no access through the windows.
Yes.
You have somebody who's probably been knifed in an alleyway.
Yes.
Or, whatever it may be. And that's exactly what Chandler means when he says that it was Dashiell Hammett who gave murder back to people who commit it for reasons and not just to provide a corpse. And very often in a Golden Age novel, you are waiting for the body.
Yes.
Whereas I don't think you are when you read a noir thriller.
No. Not only are you not waiting for the... Oh, go on. Carry on.
Well, I was just going to say, because very often in noir literature and in noir films, the mystery might not necessarily be who the killer is. The mystery might be what they're trying to keep suppressed. You might know who the killer is. It might be a professional killer, it might be a gangster, and you know it's him. But what is it that he's hiding?
Yes.
And it's that leads on to a certain line of inquiry, with it leads on to another line of inquiry, which is why you then get labyrinthine plots and what have you. But at the center of it will be something major.
Yeah.
So, but in a Golden Age, it doesn't come alive until the body arrives, and because it's a game, it's a puzzle. Whereas noir fiction certainly isn't. Noir fiction is taking you by the scruff of the neck and taking you to places that you might not want to go to.
Yeah, yeah.
And and the best modern crime fiction does the same thing, and it
Correct.
tells you it might tell you something you don't want to know about yourself.
Yes. Yes.
You know, and the best noir writers to me, they hold a mirror up to the world that we live in, but they occasionally just turn it on you and say,
yeah,
what side of the fence are you on?
Yes. Yeah.
And
I think one of my
that's much more rewarding in a sense.
Yes. Yeah, I completely agree. I think one of my favorite writers who did that is Robert B. Parker. In a modern sense, I think he was just so good about presenting multiple point of views, and letting the reader decide, well, where would you fall? Because there are times where where his detective Spencer falls, that I'm like, I don't really think I agree with that. I mean, did you ever watch Spencer for Hire in the 80s?
Years and years ago, yeah.
So I love this show. Over the past year or so, we've been slowly watching the whole series. And we're about done with, there's only 3 seasons and we're about done with the 3rd season. But I remember in the very first season, it's the 80s, and so every episode was like incredibly like hard hitting with its messages. It was really gritty, and I loved it. And I was like, oh, I miss television that was just bold. It actually felt bold to me. But yeah, there was an episode straight away where Susan is pregnant and she doesn't want the baby. And that puts those two, these two, who have this, kind of not perfect, but they're meant for each other. It puts these two lovebirds into complete, tension, because one, does not want the child, the other one does, and then they have this whole moral dilemma about, well, what do you do with this? What do you do about this? Yeah, I don't know. I think there's something so. That's why I think there's something so interesting about Robert B. Parker's stuff, particularly that allows you to kind of really examine two sides of something.
That's interesting, because generally speaking, I've not read the Spencer books. I'll hold my hands up. Perhaps I should get going. But what I find interesting about that is that you've got a fictional detective, a main fictional detective, who's got a partner, because by and large they're not allowed them, because they've got to be lone wolves.
Yes.
And if they do have relationships, they're a bit like James Bond. They're doomed to failure.
Yes. Yeah.
And the only one I can think of who's got a happy married life is Maigret.
Yes, Maigret. Yes.
And it's just come to me, the bloke in Midsummer Murders. He seems to have a quite happy.
Yeah.
And he's an example of why it doesn't work for me if they've got a happy family life, because it's dull. It's very dull.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's interesting that presumably they've got a happy relationship, but this one issue comes.
Yes, I mean they do have a generally happy relationship, but it is complicated in other ways, and I think that's another thing that I like about Parker particularly, and his sort of, if we jump to the film noir of the 80s, where we're getting his TV show and then his books and stuff, the way he kind of handles the loner private eye having a sustained relationship, a sustained romantic relationship with someone that isn't doomed to fail, in each book, and it allows Parker to explore a new side of the private eye, because every single other private eye has been, a solo guy, or gal. Because even, I mean, I guess Sarah Paretsky's V.I. Wasarski does have a few recurring love interests and stuff like that, but the relationship that Spencer has with Susan Silverman is quite unique. But admittedly, there were fans at the time who hated her, who hated the idea of the hard-boiled PI having a having a love interest, having a lady to come home to at night, because that's so it's the antithesis of what we see with Marlowe and Spade and everyone else. Even Ross MacDonald's Lew Archer is divorced, isn't he? So
yeah,
it's all quite grim.
People like Rebus is divorced, and
he
has a number of girlfriends through those books, but they never seem to last very long. he seems to keep making the same mistakes in the relationship side of things that he's always made, and you think he'd learn, but he doesn't seem to. But I sort of find that quite, in an odd way, I find that romantic in its own, that he is one man trying to make a difference, and he's the loneliness of it. One of the films I think we're going to touch on is Poodle Springs, which is it's James Caan as Philip Marlowe. I think it's from about 1998.
1988. 1998.
98?
Not 88. 1998.
And it's an adaptation of, funnily enough, Chandler's last novel, but finished by Robert B. Parker.
Robert B. Parker, indeed.
And there's a line in it where Marlowe's he's an older Marlowe. He's an older but not wiser Marlowe. And he's just had a frightening experience, and he's talking to a police detective who's clearly a friend, and he says, one thing I've learned over the years is this is a loner's job.
Yes.
And I'm not that man anymore. There was nobody cared if I ever came home, but now they do, or worse to that effect. And I find that a very poignant and powerful moment in it, because that is Marlowe saying, I am not the same fella I was 20 years ago. I have different priorities. And of course, he learns that he's just had a bad day at the office, really. He carries on investigating anyway. But it's the lonely. When he says it's a loner's job, I find that there's something quite compelling about that.
Yes,
that sort of character. He does it on it. And one of the Chandler books, I think Marlowe says something like, "I needed a holiday, and I needed life insurance, and I needed someone to hold at night, and I had a hat, a gun, and a coat, and I put them all on and went out the door or something."
Yeah.
And it's that sense of an abject loneliness that is filled by investigating other people's problems.
Yes.
That I find very compelling.
Yeah.
But when if somebody can do a relationship like it sounds Parker does, that informs the character rather than just gives him a love interest for the sake of having a love interest. That could be very interesting. I would be interested to see what he does.
I think you should check it out. If you haven't yet, do check out Spencer's the Spencer series, because I really like what he does, and Susan provides a lot of very good insight, I think. She's a psychologist, and so you have this kind of the loner PI, who has a shrink for a girlfriend, and
perhaps that says it all.
And I think it does.
Yeah,
I think it does. So I think we say all this to kind of paint a picture of what film noir sort of takes from when it comes from the literature, what it takes from the what it learned from Spade, and what it sort of reacted to, what hard-boiled fiction was as a reaction to sort of golden age fiction and all that kind of stuff. It's this sort of golden age is very much, we're going to make sure justice is had, where the hard-boiled noir stuff is very much, there is no such thing as a happy ending. There is no real justice.
It might say we will see justice done, but it might not be the justice you expect or want. It'll be the justice that we think is right. So
we got the first kind of major film noir out there was the Maltese Falcon. I don't remember the first time I saw this film. I've seen it so many times that it's way in the distant past. But the Maltese Falcon, both as a novel and as a film, really establishes all of the tropes that you're going to get within this genre. Tropes that to this day remain tried and tested. What was your initial reaction when you first saw the Maltese Falcon? if you can remember?
Being absolutely amazed at what I'd just seen, to be perfectly frank. Because I will have gone to it expecting a detective story.
Yes.
In the sense of detectives on the case and there is a crime and he investigates it. And there are crimes in it, but it's not a straightforward detective story. It's a story about a detective.
Yes.
And this harks back to the Holmes thing, that they are often stories about the detective, but they're not necessarily detective stories. And there's a very subtle, that sounds a very pedantic thing to say, but there is a difference.
There is.
We expect a detective story to do certain things, and the Maltese Falcon doesn't necessarily do it, book or film.
Yeah.
And it's such a close adaptation of the book that the film is almost, it's almost as if John Huston, who directed and did the screenplay, took a cake slice and just cut through the book and said, "There's the script, and I'll just write the stage direction."
Yes.
Yeah. And that does two things. That to me does two things. It demonstrates just how good a book that is, and just how cinematic a book it is. Before the cinema was, Hammett wasn't writing for the screen, not like Chandler will have been. So he's cinematic without knowing he is. And Huston is such a good filmmaker. He knows not to spoil or tinker with something that doesn't need tinkering with.
Yes.
It's an astonishing. I mean, it's complex, but it's completely uncompromising.
Yes.
It doesn't pull any punches. Literally, it doesn't pull any punches, because I think almost everybody in it gets hit at some point.
Yes.
And there's the great scene where Bogart Sam Spade says to the perfectly cast Peter Lorre as Joel Cairo, when you're slapped, you'll take it and like it, and it's a great line. And I think I was struck just by how brutal it is.
Yes.
We get a very clear view of Spade getting kicked in the head.
Yes.
And having been drugged, and the build up to the drugging, it's so leisurely that you don't know it's happening, and that's very clever because Spade doesn't know it's happening either.
Yeah.
But the kick to the head, I remember sort of, wow.
Yeah.
Because even now, there's a certain James Bond film which is always cut for television because Bond kicks somebody in the head. But the Maltese Falcon is shown at sort of 10:30 in the morning every couple of months, and it's there in full view,
And you get it.
And you get it, yeah. It's amazing. So I think it was that. I think it was so uncompromising, and it did what all great film adaptations do. If you've not read the book, it sent me straight to the book.
Yes.
And again, I was then doubly amazed because of how close it was.
Yeah.
And how close an adaptation it is. But I think it's the granddaddy of all for me. I think it's almost a perfect film.
Yes.
It's almost a perfect film. There are certain scripts they say can be studied on an academic basis for PhDs. And I did a radio and TV script writing masters many years ago. And we looked at certain scripts, and Witness was one. Harrison Ford's Witness was one.
Yeah.
Chinatown was another. We'll come on to that later. And I always thought that the Maltese Falcon could have been one as well, because there's almost nothing in that isn't cinematic.
Yes.
But isn't also tied very much to its literary source.
Yeah. Yes.
And on top of that, it sets the standard more than any other film that's gone before, I would argue. It sets the standard for what film noir eventually becomes.
Yes.
So there's the femme fatale, there's the detective, or the protagonist, we ought to say, I suppose, who is designed to be the fall guy. there's the shadowy villain that nobody really knows about.
Yes.
And there's the henchman who, he's so good because he's so useless almost.
Yes.
Yes. And it's got the greatest MacGuffin of all. Hitchcock always talks about a MacGuffin, but it's got the greatest MacGuffin of all because the Maltese Falcon itself could be anything. It doesn't really matter what it is. It's just what it is above all else is a fantastic title.
Yes.
And that's really all it needs to be.
Yeah.
Because, the rest of it doesn't really matter. What it is doesn't really matter. Where it comes from doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
The fact is, these people all want it.
Yeah. I guess it represents that. It's lust, it's greed, it's unabashed lust and greed. And I think will destroy you.
Yes, it's the best MacGuffin of all because it's a bit like the Ark in Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Exactly.
It's a great MacGuffin because it shows each of the characters' specific views of it.
Yes.
From that you learn about them. So it has a function, I suppose, in that sense. Yeah, but I mean, the way the script is written, the book is written, it as long as it had a catchy title, it could have been anything. It doesn't have to be a bird. It could have been anything.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But and then the more film noir I watched, the more I came to love the Maltese Falcon because the sort of the cliche, I suppose, is that the male character in a typical film noir will be an everyman who ends up being completely duped and he ends up worse off than he started. A classic example coming up when we get to a certain film. But Sam Spade is not that. Sam Spade is cold, and he's like all great fictional detectives. He's one step ahead of everybody else, and he knows what's going on, and he knows how to play these people to get what he wants the outcome to be, and that's very clever. That's very clever writing, and it's very clever playing on Bogart's part.
Yeah,
because there are he gives certain glimpses, the way he looks at certain people or reacts to certain people, particularly in the office at the start when Mary Aster's giving her "my sister's gone missing" speech, and this is the case that's being brought to you. You can tell from Bogart's performance he doesn't believe a word of it already.
Yes.
And later on he says to her, "We didn't believe you, we believed you $200."
Yeah.
And that's a great character line to show what Sam Spade is.
Yes.
And he's much more brutal than Marlowe is.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
He's almost unpleasant and unlikable.
Yeah.
But it's his doggedness and his determination.
Yeah.
That what he is doing is right. That makes you would want him at your back.
Yeah.
More than you would want to be on the wrong side of him, sort of thing. And that's it's a very cinematic performance, but it's a very good performance because it gets all that across.
Yeah. There's a really interesting correlation with Shel Hammett's characters, I think, and his protagonist for his novels. Sam Spade, as you say, he really isn't. He is far, far, far from a good guy. Where when you get to Marlowe is sort of the tarnished knight. Marlowe is he is meant to be the most, not the most, but he is in some degree a righteous guy. Sam Spade is very much not that. I mean, it's fascinating that Sam Spade is not only having an affair with his partner's wife, but he's also so he's having an affair, but he's also I don't know, he's also very kind of in his own way slimy, really.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, he's having an affair with his partner's wife, and when I don't think he's giving anything away for anyone who's not seen it already. But
spoilers for all these films.
Spoilers for all these films, yeah. When that partner is killed quite early on, the widow comes seek solace from Spade, and he won't speak. He gets the secretary to do it. You know, he's
it's
the
so
worst
cold.
type of cad.
Yeah,
and yet, and he's unlike Marlowe, who, when Marlowe meets gangsters, he's very self-righteous. You know, they're all sleaze and they're all scum.
Yeah.
But Spade sits drinking with them, you know, talking to them as businessmen.
Yeah.
You know, and that's a major difference. But it's a lot more realistic.
Yeah.
Than, as to what as I imagine a private eye would be in that period. And Hammett, of course, was one. Hammett's writing from personal experience because he worked for Pinkertons.
Yes, he did.
So you wonder how much of Hammett is in Spade, you know. But Spade treats his investigation for what it is.
Yes.
Because really, the entire film is a sort of bargaining scene in the middle of a lot of. I lied to you last time, but I'm telling you the truth this time. Well, I know I lied to you the last 2 times, but this time it really is the truth. Until, you know, and Spade just keeps going with the flow and saying that's fine, whatever, you know, because he really knows what's going on. But he maintains that ruthlessness, you know, which is epitomized when he says, you know, when you get out in 20 years, maybe come and see me, or you know, that's assuming they don't hang you. You know, and that. I mean, that is brutal. There's no sort of hope of, you know, a Marlowe type romance there.
No, it's
any sort of chivalry. Marlowe's very proud of his chivalry.
Yes,
but Spade ain't got any.
No, he doesn't. Not at all. No.
And what's great about the film is they don't shy away from that side of it. They don't tone him down for a cinema audience, which happens quite a lot if you think about it over the years. You know, I mean, the character of James Bond, for example, was toned down dramatically from the books to the films. Yeah. And Sherlock Holmes.
It's almost fair. I would almost argue that Bond in cinema and Bond in books are just entirely different characters.
Yeah. Oh, they are. And I mentioned before when I saw the Maltese Falcon, and then I was blown away by it, and I was blown away by the book because it was so similar. But when I first read a Fleming novel, I was blown away by just how different it is.
Yes.
I was thinking, this isn't Roger Moore.
Thank God.
Where are the one-liners? And then you think, this is actually something quite different.
Yeah.
And Fleming, I think, is a very underrated author.
See, I agree. I completely agree with that. I my back goes up when people try to sort of diminish Fleming and diminish the literary Bond. And I'm like, if you're trashing literary Bond, it's because you don't understand literary Bond.
Yeah.
You know, the cinematic version of Bond is you know, the you know, macho hero guy. You know, it's the you know, fantasy that guys kind of want to aspire to and you know, whatever. But that is far from what is in the books. That is far from what Fleming wrote.
Yeah, I think the closest we ever get is the very first 2 Connerys.
Yeah.
Before it goes a bit too overblown with Goldfinger. The first 2 Connerys and License to Kill with Timothy Dalton.
Yes, License to Kill, yes.
Which I maintain is the most Fleming of all the films. Because
I can see that. I mean,
some of its best sequences are taken from the novel Live and Let Die.
Yeah.
But in that film, I mean, Dalton was ahead of his time. Dalton was Daniel Craig before Daniel Craig was Daniel Craig, you know.
Absolutely.
And what I prefer about Dalton's tortured Bond is that there's no sort of looking at the camera and saying, I'm a tortured Bond look, which I get the impression with Daniel Craig, I get the impression they're sort of waving a flag with it, you know.
A little bit.
With Dalton's Bond, it's much more subdued and it's much more subtle.
Yes. Yeah.
But I would not mess with Timothy Dalton's James Bond in a million, and I wouldn't mess with Sean Connery's. But I reckon I could go toe to toe with Roger Moore's Bond.
I would say so. Absolutely.
A couple of times, you know.
But
I don't want to come across as dissing Craig, but the Casino Royale is fantastic.
Oh yes,
stays for me the best of his films.
It is.
But I think it's no coincidence that the central part of that film is a pretty decent adaptation of the novel Casino Royale.
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree. And yeah, I mean, I think I would I mean, I guess Fleming's is started kind of writing in the late 50s, or Bond started coming out in the late 50s or early, something like that,
mid 50s,
mid 50s. They're really, I think, even with this kind of pulling this back to kind of noir stuff, there are more similarities, with what Fleming was doing with like the spy novel that connects to the noir stuff that was coming out in the 20 years prior to his emergence, really.
Absolutely. And Fleming and Chandler were great friends.
They were
drinking buddies, I think. But
yes.
I would love to see a Netflix Bond series set in the 50s, shot in black and white, with an unknown actor as Bond, and going back to the book. Not necessarily the novels as plots, but going back to the spirit of the novels. I think that would be fantastic. I doubt it'll ever happen, but I think it'd be fantastic.
Yeah, no, it wouldn't, but yeah.
But yeah, my point was that they don't do any of that diluting with Sam Spade.
Spade, no.
Houston gives you, in Bogart's performance, the Sam Spade that's in the book, and it's completely unfiltered. It's warts and all is the phrase, isn't it? You see him do good, but you see him do some pretty loathsome things as well. Yeah. But his intentions are always for the best. It's always to get the right result, as he sees it in his code. So he plays dirty, but it's in a good cause, and sometimes the end justifies the means. That seems to be the point of the Sam Spade character to me. And similarly, the Continental Op, Hammett's other character.
Yes,
he does very similar things in some of those books that Spade does in the Maltese Falcon.
Yeah, I mean, in the Red Harvest, he's just gunning people down.
Yeah.
He is covered in blood by the end of that one.
Well, and is that the one where he sets one gang against another?
Yes.
And infiltrates them both from the inside. Yeah. I mean, that's got its genesis in the second half of the Holmes novel, The Valley of Fear, where a Pinkerton detective is sent to a mining community in Pennsylvania to break up a murder gang.
Yeah.
That half of that novel is an absolutely fantastic private eye novella.
Which actually that leads me to an interesting question, I think, and that is, what is noir doing? What is both hard-boiled noir fiction doing, and what is noir doing? And I think what we're getting at with this particular stuff is they're very much making interesting commentary on society. In a way, and this isn't speaking negatively, but it's just the truth. In a way that Golden Age fiction doesn't really do, because that's not the point of Golden Age fiction.
No.
Holmes does a little bit, but the Christie, all that kind of stuff, that's not what their focus is. But with, when you get to things like, you see it within the Maltese Falcon, but you probably see it a little bit more in the next film, which is The Glass Key. That I think is a really good example of encapsulating what hard-boiled fiction, what noir is really doing, what its message is, and that is looking at the kind of the greed, the corruption of the society around them. There is no sort of way out. I thought The Glass Key, I think, is such an interesting novel and film, because nobody is good in that.
No.
Like, even remotely, no one is good in that. But the way that it explores very interesting topics of political corruption, corruption in the newspapers, things like that. And then you sort of, kind of see how that reflects today with, current problems of people, saying fake news and things like that. And, acting like saying fake news is on the rise. And it's like, guys, 100 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I agree. It's, with all that. And it's no coincidence, I don't think, that it's another Hammett novel. And another Hammett adaptation. And I strongly suspect it was things that he'd seen when he was a Pinkerton agent. He will have investigated something else. But you're absolutely right. And Golden Age only really, and even Golden Age pastiches, they only really touch on things that are relevant today. If you can somehow make it relevant to then, if you know what I mean. So motives for the murder, they can resonate with today, but they're never really going to be today's issues because they're not. But I mean, I think you'd be hard pushed to find any society through the years that doesn't have some political corruption going on somewhere, So, and the same with the media. You're absolutely right about fake news and media bias that is all over social media and in all our consciousness now. That is exactly what the Glass Key is about. That is a direct resonance with the current society and state of society that we have now. You're right. There are no sort of nice characters in it. But if they were nice people, they wouldn't be in the position that they were in. True. It's always been so it's a question of who's not as bad as the others.
Yes. Yes.
And Alan Ladd's character is obviously the one that you're meant to root for.
Yes.
But and he somehow is not so much in the book, I don't think, but in the film he's presumably because it's Alan Ladd, he's almost distanced from some of the real nastiness. Yes. It's more Brian Donlevy who's involved in it. And,
yes.
But I think in the book that's less so. I think
in the book Ned Beaumont is in Beaumont, Ned Beaumont is very much he's really not a good guy, but you do get that sense in the film version that he is not, his hands aren't as dirty, as Paul's hands are.
Yeah, I always get the impression he's sort of he's his right hand man, I suppose, and he's trying to do best by him. Yeah. So he's trying to do something right for somebody.
Yes. But,
Hammett's world doesn't have tarnished Sir Galahads like Chandler's world.
No, not at all.
They are often dirty people doing dirty things. But I remember going back to what we were saying about the Maltese Falcon and the kick to the head.
Yes.
There's a similar, pretty brutal assault on Alan.
Yes, there is. Yes.
And again, for the time, I mean, we think that films made in the 40s were sort of gentler somehow, but they weren't at all. They weren't at all. They were absolutely ruthless.
Yeah. I mean, his escape from that capture, where if you remember, he breaks the window and then falls onto the roof and then falls through and smashes. Yeah. Oh my gosh! I mean, you're watching it and you're like, you are cringing because you're like, that is so painful. And then what's great about it is the next 15 minutes of the film is him recovering in the hospital, because of course he would.
Of course he would, and that's one of the things I love about both the book and the film Casino Royale. There is a period where he has to recover from the particularly unpleasant torture scene, which is more unpleasant for one half of the audience than it is for another, I suspect. But,
I think so.
But the reality is that he wouldn't be getting up from that anytime soon, and nor would Alan Ladd.
Oh.
You know, and it's the same when Bogart's been drugged and kicked to the head in the Maltese Falcon. When he gets up, he's not, he's not functioning properly. You can tell he isn't, and that's the added dose of realism that Hammett gives it. And Chandler was quite open. He said he makes, whenever Marlowe gets hit on the head, he gets up too quickly. So
yes,
he's quite open about it. But
yes,
there is that added realism, and I think in a wider sense of discussing film noir, scenes like that, particularly Alan Ladd's beating, do exactly what film noir wants to do, which is say to you, when you leave the movie theatre, if you turn the wrong way down the street, there will be somebody doing this. Or every sort of darkened window you walk past, this could be happening in.
Yes.
And that's what film noir is doing. It's reminding you that bad things happen, and bad things happen for reasons. And when we start talking about film noir and protagonists being every man, it's one step further, because it's saying, and it could happen to you.
Exactly.
That's what I mean about it. It's putting a mirror up to you, the reader or the viewer, and saying, well, what are you going to do about this situation, sort of thing. Yeah. And you don't get that in any other type of, not to an extent that you do in film noir, in any other type of crime fiction.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you think about it, just even through the ages, if you think about, the old stuff again, yes, these particular individuals, from the Marlowe stuff to films like Dead Reckoning, through to today, like a movie like Drive, which is kind of a neo-noir movie. I mean, these are, or which is more of a comment, kind of a spoof of, but Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. These are your average Joes who just get swept up into this wide world of corruption. And it's even people like Marlowe and Spade and stuff like that. They aren't supermen. They aren't the James Bonds who can just go in and take stuff down. They really are just your average Joe.
They are, yeah, and that's where they're again much more identifiable than someone like Holmes.
Yes, and
certainly someone like Poirot. I mean,
yes,
you can't identify with a genius unless you are a genius, and the majority of us aren't.
Damn it!
But Marlowe and Spade, they are, and Rebus to a certain extent, and people like that, characters like that. They are people that do a job to the best of their ability, using their guts and their wits.
Yeah.
There are no sort of dogs in the nighttime type clues here that they can make an intuitive leap.
Yeah.
No, and there's no sort of particular cigar end that can only have been smoked by one person. Yeah. That they are people who are just using their instincts, and that makes them instantly more believable.
Yes.
Instantly more believable.
Fun facts here. Barry in the chat said that William Bendix actually knocked out Alan Ladd during the fight scene in The Glass Key.
No, I didn't know that. I'm not surprised. And I'm also not surprised that the last word in that comment from Barry is ouch, because William Bendix was a big man.
He was.
And notoriously, Alan Ladd wasn't.
Yes. It was funny when I was rewatching The Glass Key for tonight. I did get this sense of Alan Ladd. He's a great actor. There is a part of me, a small part of me, it's like, but is he a good Ned Beaumont? And I'm not sold on him as Ned Beaumont 100%. It's sort of like a 70%. I think when I first read The Glass Key, the vision of Ned Beaumont was someone who was a little bit, probably more like William Bendix. Really, the guy who played Jeff would make more sense as a Ned Beaumont in terms of size, and I think intimidation value.
I agree
But
with that because Alan Ladd, for all his qualities, he never really sells me as anybody who's intimidating.
no.
I think a lot of he's excellent as the Great Gatsby.
Yes.
The 1940s version of the Great Gatsby, and he's ideal for that. And he's better in the Blue Dahlia, I think.
I agree. Yes.
Because I can believe that he was that man. But as you said before, the Glass Key requires somebody to be a bit who's not afraid to go and wade into a scrap. And I don't necessarily get that with Alan Ladd. And I do wonder whether he famously had chemistry with Veronica Lake.
Yes, I mean it was a little bit sizzling.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the critics with the Glass Key, I think, said Brian Donlevy and Alan Ladd have no chemistry, but my God, Veronica Lake and Alan Ladd have ooze it, And,
yes,
and it's true. It's true. And they made a lot of films together. So I'm not sure of the chronology of that, but I wonder whether he was cast partly because they knew that him and Lake would
work together.
Yeah, and a bankable asset.
Bankable
asset. Quite a lot of film casting is down to that, isn't it?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But I think since we were speaking of Veronica Lake, I think it would be a good time to talk about the femme fatale. But because what was fascinating to me is obviously you have Bridget O'Shaughnessy in the Maltese Falcon, who is the quintessential femme fatale. She is the dame who, is using her sexual charms to get what she wants from people standing in her way and manipulating individuals to further her cause. And she does that with Spade. She does that all over the place. And then of course this becomes a really standard trope throughout the genre. I think most if you watch the Maltese Falcon, or if you watch Dead Reckoning, or The Big Sleep, or things like this, you see this sort of pattern quite a bit, where the ultimate villain in the end is this dominatrix kind of individual.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating to me is that Dashiell Hammett didn't go back to that trope for this book, for The Glass Key, because Janet isn't responsible for the murder.
No.
In the end, which ultimately that becomes the cliche, is that you don't suspect the beautiful woman who the detective fancies, but ultimately that is his downfall, and that is he has trusted the wrong person, that being this person that he's falling in love with. But it was very interesting to me that the Glass Key doesn't fall into that trap.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and I wish I knew why he doesn't go back to it. Because it becomes, as you say, it eventually becomes a cliche. And some films try and do something with it and subvert the cliche, and some don't. But it's I don't know, it is fascinating, that, and it's actually not something I've ever really thought about, to be honest. I suppose Hammett thought, well, I've done that.
Yeah,
I don't really want to. And what's more, he does it so well with Bridget O'Shaughnessy that I think if he tried to do it again, there's a very real danger that it would just be a diluted version.
Yes.
And then it would ultimately fail. And if the femme fatale fails, then very often the whole film noir thing will fail. The whole story will fail,
Yeah.
So maybe there was a sense of that. Maybe he thought, well, I've done that character and I've done it so well, I don't need to do it again. I mean, I don't know. But it is interesting, because everyone that comes after the Maltese Falcon, you can bet your bottom dollar there is one. She might not be she might not be as ruthless as Bridget O'Shaughnessy is.
Yes.
And she might not even be the villain.
Yes.
But
right.
you might for a while suspect she is.
Yeah.
because
Absolutely.
that is one of those tropes, that's...
It's interesting because it's almost as if Hammett kind of does the inverse of the Maltese Falcon, where instead of the femme fatale manipulating the detective is actually manipulating the femme fatale because he accuses her of being the murderer, and pushes it to the extent that he brings the cops to the house, pushes it to the extent of he was going to have them arrest her, but he's doing this all in the hope that the actual murderer will confess, and that murderer being the dad, which is like
that's a hell of a risky gameplay, isn't it?
right. Just a quick one. Phil is in the chat. He's saying hello. He says just checking in, keep up the fun conversation. We're doing our best, Phil.
We're doing our best.
We will see you next week, Philip.
I think I can't think of another reason. Putting your right ahead on, Luke. I suppose you say, well, I've done that to the best of my ability. I needn't do it again, and that's the only creative reason I can think that he doesn't, unless it's just simply that he couldn't think of another. The stories that came to him they'd be shoehorned in for the sake of shoehorning in, and sometimes crime fiction can do that.
Yeah.
Sometimes I sometimes wonder whether we need to have in Ian Rankin's Rebus books whether Maurice Cafferty always needs to be there. He's a popular. I hope Ian's not watching this.
If Ian Rankin is watching my show,
why not? He's a very popular character, but sometimes you do think, do we need him?
Right. Yeah.
And a lot of crime. I'm not just picking on Ian Rankin for that. A lot of crime writers do it. That there has to be a certain element or a certain character, or they expect me to do this, so I will do it. Because it's become a series.
Yeah.
And if Hammett is consciously rebelling against that sort of thing, then hats off to him, I say. And good on him for not doing it again. Yeah. But it is interesting. I'd like to hear some views on that.
Yeah, I would say comparing Hammett to Chandler, I think all of Hammett's novels do sort of end slightly differently. They don't always they don't all fall back on the femme fatale trope totally. Red Harvest is there is no femme fatale behind all this. It is it is just pure gangsters and corruption and that kind of stuff. So conscious of time and conscious of the amount of films that we have to talk about. Let's chat about for a few minutes about Indemnity Only, because I will just say straight out the gate, I don't like this film.
Right.
It is not my favorite. It could have been good, but to me it let me down because I felt that it's sort of the way that it opens up with the guy. I can't remember the protagonist's name of the film now. But the main guy opens up with the main dude. He's shot. He's recounting what's going on. And from that moment on, you're kind of the sense of danger, the sense of what's going to happen is slightly deflated because you're coming in at such a kind of a point where he's not going to survive, and then of course he doesn't survive. So that sort of tension as to what is going to happen to him felt weak to me. But then I just never felt myself quite taken with the whole plot of it. I don't know. What are your thoughts on it?
This is Double Indemnity.
Yes. You're like, I love this film. It's the best thing ever.
I do love this film. but I fully take on board the fact that giving the ending away does... you run the risk of some of the stakes being taken away as well.
Yeah.
But what saves it for me, there are a couple of things that save it for me. Edward G. Robinson saves it for a start as the insurance investigator. Always talking about the little man in here, that's his instinct. There's something not right about this claim. That's a great character.
Yes.
It's a Raymond Chandler screenplay from James N. Cain's novel.
Yes.
And a bit, as we were saying about Chandler's novels, once that dialogue starts kicking in,
yes,
I've sort of forgotten that Fred McMurray's dying. And I mean, when you're confronted with that, there's a great sequence between Fred McMurray and Barbara Stanwyck when he says he's flirting with her, and she says there's a speed limit in this state, officer. There's a speed limit in this state, and he says, "How fast was I going, officer?" And she says, "Fast enough." And only Chandler could do that.
Yes.
And there's a line about one of my favorite lines in it is, "Who could ever have known that murder smelled like honeysuckle?"
Yes.
That is Chandler. It's Chandler all over. He's all over that script with lines like that. But my problem with Double Indemnity is that I don't buy Fred McMurray. I think Fred McMurray is too self-aware that he's saying things that people don't really say. Yes. Nobody talks like a Raymond Chandler character. Nobody says things that he puts into their mouths, because nobody talks like that. And I think there's a trick to Raymond Chandler, to speaking Raymond Chandler, and that is not to let on that that people don't talk like it. And Fred McMurray's always got that glint in his eye that says, "I know this is smart dialogue, and I know it's firecracker dialogue, and I'm going to make them." So and he doesn't strike me as being that much of a sap that he'd be into it so thoroughly. Don't ask me who I'd have cast instead. No idea. But he just seems to be wrong for it.
Yeah, I can see that.
But it doesn't jar so much that I can't get through the film because I love it. I just sort of have to say to myself, well, you have to live with Fred. But again, Chandler's dialogue does, even though he's knowingly saying it, it does come across. But what I think is brilliant about it, and I'm not sure, it's a long time since I've read the book, but maybe I'm misremembering, but I don't know if it is in the book. It's so obviously in the book. The relationship between these two people, and he's an insurance salesman, and she's a married woman who wants to bump off her husband for the insurance claim. He comes up with this idea of double indemnity. I get the very strong feeling when I watch this film that if he'd not come along, she would have only ever dreamt about killing her husband.
Right.
And if he'd not delivered those insurance papers to her, he would never have dreamt about killing a man at all.
Yes.
And it's the relationship. So the almost as if the double of double indemnity is that it's them two combined. They are the double that make it happen. An individual, none of it would have happened.
I see that.
I think that's a really fascinating piece of script writing.
Yeah.
Because it shows that they are both.
Yes.
Well, one's in the wrong place at the wrong time, and one is in absolutely the right place at the right time. Yes. And vice versa, sort of thing. But depending on which side of the fence you're on. I think that's really clever, and I do sort of quite like the circular narrative that you end up where you started.
I see. I don't mind that because Dead Reckoning does that, and I sort of it. But Dead Reckoning does it in a way that you pick up close to the end. and then because he comes into the Rip Murdoch comes into the church. He's wounded and stuff, and he's confessing to the father there, Father Logan, about everything that's going on to him. And then you get the bulk of the film happens through that. But then, we catch up to where he is now, and then there's still another like 20 minutes of movie left to sort of get through, which I think helped, because this whole time that he's confessing everything to this father, he is we're waiting for these villains to catch up with him, and then whereas in Double Indemnity, he is we're just waiting for him to die, really.
I get that. I part of me wonders whether it's, again, it's Chandler's writing, I suppose, in the way he works best when it's first person.
Yes.
And I wonder whether the flashback, because they do it again in Murder My Sweet.
Yes, they do. Yes.
Dick Powell is Philip Marlowe, and he starts off with bandages on his eyes, which in actual fact is a much more intriguing. You're right. You do know that Fred McMurray's been shot and he's confessing, so you know that he's done. But why on earth has Philip Marlowe got eye bandages on?
Right
at the beginning of this film, that's a much more intriguing sell.
Yeah.
But the upshot is that they both end up being told in flashback, with someone telling someone else the story.
Yes.
And what that enables them to do is say, I was in my office and I was doing this, and she came in, and I'm not going to do an off the cuff Raymond Chandler type simile, because it will fail, but you know what I mean.
Yes.
And I think it's interesting that they don't do that in The Big Sleep. That there's no voiceover in The Big Sleep.
No.
So I wonder whether part of that is just a way of sort of getting Chandler's speech, his lines and his first person narrative into the film, because otherwise you would lose it. But I accept that it's a pretty final. It's a final opening scene. There's no way to get out of it.
No. But sort of speaking on that stuff as well, though, kind of pivoting over to Dead Reckoning, I loved. I mean, the voiceover in that film, I love it. I love Murdoch's entire, inner monologue. I think it elevates the film to a new height. Like, if it didn't, you almost don't necessarily need the voiceover, but the fact that it's there adds this nice extra kind of spice, I think, to the whole thing. The other thing that's interesting to me about Dead Reckoning is this is something because I rewatched this as well leading up to tonight, and there were two things that stood out to me. Do you like comic books at all?
Yeah, some of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I was sitting there watching it, and I was thinking, okay, you have Rip Murdoch, who's gone into a church, and he's confessing his sins to a father, and he's a rogue sort of vigilante at the moment. And I couldn't help but think, this is Daredevil.
Daredevil. Yeah, I knew you were going to say that. Yeah.
I was like, this is Daredevil. Like, wait a minute. Like, and then, I mean, I don't know if when they were creating Daredevil, if this film had any sort of influence, but I'm like, they're both like very street level, bottom of the tier guy has to go fight the top of the tier kind of corrupted businessman. I'm just like, this is Daredevil versus Kingpin. Like, that is what this is, And
I'll tell you what, that's one of those points, Lou, that if you'd not thought of it before, and then somebody told it you'd then not be able to get that out of your head.
Yeah.
So every time you watch Dead Reckoning, now you're going to say, well, this is Daredevil.
It is. It's stuck down my head forever. And I've seen this film several times, but it wasn't until this most recent time that I was like, Murdoch, because Murdoch was in my head. Probably because Daredevil was just recently on She-Hulk, and I talked about it last week.
Daredevil's alias is Murdoch.
Matt Murdock, exactly.
Matt Murdock. So,
I was like, wait a minute here.
The more I think about this, now you've mentioned it, the more I think this is intentional.
I think so. I think there's something to.
I reckon Frank Miller
Reckoning.
had watched a good dose of Dead Reckoning before he did his run on Daredevil.
Yeah, because again, when you think about Daredevil, Daredevil is quite noir. The way he sort of the way he self narrates more so than your kind of standalone Wolverine issues and things like that. Daredevil is very, very noir and street level stuff, which again, watching Dead Reckoning, I was like, oh god, this is interesting.
And to keep the comic book thing going, when he's done well and when they set out to do a noir version, Batman is a film noir detective.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, you look at a film like The Dark Knight, and you swap a trilby and a trench coat for a cowl and a cape, and you've got a film noir. You've got a modern film noir. It's about gangsters. It's about strong moral choices.
Yes.
It's about blurring the lines between right and wrong.
Yeah.
It just so happens that your detective is dressed as a bat, and if you can get over that, then you've got a pretty hefty film noir. And the new Batman film, I think, is
I was going to say
it's cut from similar cloth.
Yeah.
Because one of the things the cliche about film noir is it's always raining, and I don't think there's a scene in that new Batman film where it isn't raining. It seems to be constantly pouring down with rain.
Yep.
And that's not a criticism. That's not a complaint. I liked it. I thought it was very good indeed. But you're right. The comic books can have and Constantine, something like Constantine.
Yes.
Also,
yes.
I mean, he looks like Philip Marlowe.
He does. Yeah. With this kind of scruffy.
Yes. He might be fighting something supernatural.
Yeah. But then you also have Rorschach, who is he is the hard-boiled guy.
He is, absolutely. And I always thought Rorschach is what a real life Batman would be.
Yes.
If you didn't have the money to create a Batmobile and dress up as a bat, you would go out in a trench coat and a trilby and do what Batman does with his fists.
Yeah.
Because Rorschach shares that total lack of fear of death that Bruce Wayne has. And constantly walking the streets waiting for someone to do something wrong so he can go and kick seven shades out of them. That to me is very, very Batman-esque. And the only thing that separates them is that one lives in a grotty apartment and one lives in Wayne Manor.
No, it's true. But I think kind of
one thing I would say about Dead Reckoning, it always strikes me, and this I might be grossly unfair, but since you said you didn't like Double Indemnity, I'm going to throw one back.
Oh, I got some complaints about Dead Reckoning, but you go on first.
I sometimes wonder whether it's noir by numbers, because I can see that it seems to me that Elizabeth Scott, is that the actress's name?
Yes, Elizabeth Scott, yeah.
She seems to be doing a pretty obvious imitation of Mary Aster in the Maltese Falcon.
She is terrible.
Yeah. And obviously it's Bogart, so there's already that sort of but there's a line that always grates on me. And in Dead Reckoning, Bogart says, when a man's friend is killed, he ought to do something about it. And Sam Spade in the Maltese Falcon, Bogart again, says, when a man's partner is killed, he ought to do something about it.
Yes.
And I think to myself, is that a coincidence? Because it's a fairly significant one if it is.
Yeah.
And then, like I say, with the Elizabeth Scott thing and the Mary Aster impersonation, I might be being grossly unfair.
She is genuinely not very good in this movie. As the femme fatale, as she just isn't. It's lacking. She's delivering lines.
It seems to have all the tropes of a noir, but they seem to be there because they are noir rather than through any sort of organic reason. It is told in flashback, and it's the themes are doomed romance, conspiracy.
Yeah, there was no reason for her to be the femme fatale. She didn't need to be a villain in the
Yeah,
end.
and going back, that harks back to what you said, what we were saying before about do people put these things in because they think there needs to be one?
Yes.
And I think I often wonder if that's true of Dead Reckoning.
Yeah, I would say so. I think that is one of its big failings is going too heavy into the cliches, because there are some really cool moments in there. I think watching the way Murdoch sort of tries to, he uses his army code stuff to communicate with his buddy, to meet up with him at the hotel, how he wiggles his way into the mortuary, the morgue, to see the body and all that kind of stuff, how he deals with the other body that is left in his hotel room. There were all these really great moments that you see Rip Murdoch being a cool badass guy. And like, for example, when he goes to tell, when he meets Coral, her name's Coral something or the other. Can't remember. He calls her Mike. Is
she not called Coral Chandler?
Coral Chandler, that's it. Yes.
Again, I might say to myself, is that an in-joke, or is that,
I think so. I mean, this is 1947. He's done The Big Sleep. He's done Maltese Falcon. He is, this is very much, we got Bogart in another noir movie. I think these are references. I wouldn't be shocked if I were to go look this up and find out that they were references. But anyway, there's that moment when they meet at the club, and he does this really cool thing of, he puts his hand, they're dancing, and he puts his hand on her back because he wants to tell her that her lover is dead. Drake is dead, but he wants to know if she's going to be genuinely surprised about it. So he says, let's go dance. So they're going and they're dancing. And then while he's doing that, he's got his hand on her back, and he says this really great line of, I put my hand on her back. That way I can feel if she tenses when I tell her that he's dead. And I'm like, that is clever. That is cool. I like, there are really cool things and clever things about this, but also I think the villain is quite interesting. Martinelli was his name. He's
the club
interesting. Say again.
He's the owner of the club.
Yeah. I liked him. Again, he's he's basically the kingpin. But he falls into he also falls into the kind of the maybe a bit more of a cliched hyper version of the hard-boiled villain. But there is still interesting quirks that are going on. Like, he doesn't like the sight of violence, even though he is a violent man.
Yes.
And he makes his guy Krause do all the violence. But then, like, that scene when he walks into the office when Krause is beating up Murdoch, and he's like, I told you I don't want to see it. And he just stares at the picture until Krause sorts Murdoch out. I'm like, this stuff is just like, I love this stuff. Like that is, maybe not realistic, but it's like, it's just great, fun storytelling. I think
it is good storytelling, and it's a film that has flashes of greatness about it, like that, and those that you've highlighted, which makes these, when it falls flat, makes it somehow all the more flatter. And all the more obvious that it's not quite worked in certain bits. It's almost as if, I suppose it's like the old nursery rhyme that when it's great, it's brilliant.
Yeah.
But when it doesn't quite work, it really doesn't for me.
But I agree.
All opinions in this discussion are purely personal. There's no nobody's right or wrong.
I mean, I was laughing at the end when she's dying, when they had that big car crash, and then they go in this scene and she's like meant to be dying, but she's just like sort of wrapped up. Oh God, it was so bad. I think, if I remember right, I think there's some sort of connection between Elizabeth Scott and maybe the director, and I think they were in some kind of relationship or something.
That would explain a lot.
So it
That would
would
explain a lot.
it would, you know, so it's yeah, but yeah.
But yeah, you're right. There's absolutely no reason for her to be a femme fatale.
No,
Um,
no.
And I seem to remember thinking there's one twist too many.
Yes, yeah. It's her twist in particular is the one that takes it too far.
Too far. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And I think in the in the more sort of, I don't want to say better film noirs, but in the more classic film noirs,
yeah,
there is a restraint. They all know when the story is over.
Yes. Yeah.
And very often there is no time to come down from the final gunshot. You know.
Yes.
There might be one scene, two if
Yeah.
you're lucky. Certainly in, I mean, The Big Sleep just.
Oh
that almost just stops with a gunfight, you know. And Murder My Sweet is the same. There's a little bit of cheesy, I got the girl in the end, but it's only a couple of seconds, really. A minute perhaps at most.
Yeah.
Once everybody who's dead, who needs to be dead,
it's over. Yeah.
It's over, and the best film noirs do that. I think.
Yeah.
The best film noirs do that.
Yeah, I agree. Dead Reckoning overstays its welcome by about 20 minutes.
Yeah, yeah. Which is a shame, because it's always good to see Bogart. It's always good to see him do what he does best.
Yes.
And he is always watchable.
Yes.
Whatever he's in, he's one of those actors that is always worth seeing. And his performance in Dead Reckoning is no different.
He's great.
Without him, perhaps we wouldn't be talking about it today. I think that's my overall feel of that film. You know, my overall sort of what I take away from that film mostly.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. Yeah.
You know, I mean, we talked earlier about how far the right casting choices, how far they make the film.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a case in point.
Yeah.
And going back to Double Indemnity, I think there was probably people on the Hollywood studio books that would have fitted that role easier than Fred MacMurray does. It's not a bad performance. He doesn't give a bad performance.
No.
And he carries the story. But there's just certain choices he makes as an actor that I think are... It's almost like taking you out of the moment for me.
Yeah, I agree. Biffer in the chat says that he has seen 45 Bogart movies. How many movies has this guy been in?
Well, he had a significant career, I think.
45
as gangster sort of patsies in
the
30s.
Right.
I mean, I'm not sure. I think he's in Angels with Dirty Faces with James Cagney. So he had quite a significant career before Casablanca, I suppose, or before the Maltese Falcon and Casablanca. But he was very often a supporting gangster or a supporting villain.
Right, right.
Presumably because I don't think you could necessarily say that he's typical leading man material.
Yeah. No.
I would say that comes through when he does Maltese Falcon and Casablanca.
Yes.
And he becomes one of those oddly attractive men that people, you know, he has a ruthlessness to him that I think people would find attractive.
Yeah, I agree. The last sort of thing I'll say about Dead Reckoning is kind of to really not necessarily about the film itself, but about the femme fatale before we chat. Well, we're going to move away from the 1940s. We're going to jump to the 70s and the 90s where we talk and chat a little bit about The Long Goodbye and, you know, The Big Sleep and Poodle Springs before we bring this to a close. But thinking about the unnecessary femme fatale of Dead Reckoning, this is 1947. Do we think that by 1947, the femme fatale as we saw her in the Maltese Falcon, is she done? Is she overdone already?
I think she probably is. In her truest form, I think she probably is.
Yeah.
I think that because she becomes such a trope that once you see, if you watch one of these films, the minute you see usually a blonde,
Yes.
but a good-looking woman who is usually married to an older man, and she's played by somebody like Veronica Lake or
Yes.
Barbara Stanwyck or something like that, you are probably going to say, well, she's going to be involved. A bit like you do when, the most famous actor in any Midsummer Murders episode is the killer. You could almost say from the cast list,
Yes.
And I think she probably is done. And I think she's not, with the exception, I would say, of Faye Dunaway in Chinatown.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think she's, as a character, she's done very well until Vesper Lynd in Casino Royale.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Okay.
she's the next really significant femme fatale.
Yeah.
And she really is one. She's a classic one.
Yeah.
But I can't think of one off the top of my head who stands out between Faye Dunaway in Chinatown in 1974. They do something very interesting with Faye Dunaway, with Faye Dunaway's character as the femme fatale. They do something very interesting. To 2006, whatever it was.
That's
I can't think of one that really stands out to me. But yeah, I think she, a bit like film noir itself, in its truest form. I think she burnt out very quickly.
Yeah. I would say so.
Overused tropes tend to, don't they?
Yeah, and I think that's why when I think about certain Chandler novels, that I guess when we're coming out around the same time, I read a Chandler novel, but I don't feel this way because, Farewell, My Lovely, it's there is a femme fatale in that, but the way it plays out for some reason works so well, but then also ends so tragically.
I think it's because she's not in it much.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It is sparingly.
Because I also think she works very well in The Lady in the Lake.
I was going to say that as well. Yes. Yeah.
Because there's the whole mystery of The Lady in the Lake. It's very simple, really. It's so simple. It's brilliant. The very question of who mystery of The Lady in the Lake is who is the Lady in the Lake.
Yes.
And you're given about 5 different possibilities.
Yeah.
And so the femme fatale in that you don't know is one, because for a large part of the book you don't know who it is you're talking about. And that works very well. But I think in films they because she has to be a major character, I think she becomes too obvious.
Yeah, I think so. So I guess then if we kind of move ahead a few decades, I guess the last few films are all Chandler movies now. But you have The Long Goodbye with Elliot Gould as Marlowe. It's a very interesting sort of updating of film noir that definitely rubbed some people the wrong way, and then some people enjoyed it. I feel like The Long Goodbye, what is it, 1970? Can't remember, 1970 something, early 1970s.
73, I think it is.
Yeah. It was an interesting one. I do think you kind of love it or hate it. I don't know if there's any kind of middle ground with it. My initial reaction to that particular one is I really liked Gould as Marlowe. I felt the kind of grumbly, sort of intelligible dialogue was an interesting choice that I did sort of like kind of sparingly. And the film does have a sort of, it is very uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to watch because it's so it does have a very depressing kind of vibe to it. So these are the things I really liked about it. The problem that I had with this particular movie is that where, say, Double Indemnity is sort of a boring plot, but is elevated by Chandler dialogue, The Long Goodbye is an interesting story that for some reason lacks Chandler's charm, despite it being a Chandler adaptation. I don't know. What are your thoughts on The Long Goodbye?
I agree with that. The starting point for me, and I touched on the book earlier. If you read that as a novel, it is pretty much. If you try, it's unfilmable. That's what I'm going to.
Yeah.
You can't film that novel as it stands.
Yeah.
So you have to, if you're going to film it at all, you have to do something different with it.
Yeah.
And I think they do.
They
take the very barest bones of the plot and see what they can do with it. And I think that's so you do get Terry Lennox, and he might have done something that Marlowe doesn't want to know about. I think Marlowe does say to him, "You mustn't tell me if you've committed a crime, I mustn't know."
Yeah.
And he takes him to Mexico. So all that is in the book. And then he's arrested and kept in jail for a week or whatever it is, and busted out by a rich man. All that is in the book. When he starts to talk with Roger Wade, who is this drunk writer of romantic fiction of all things, played by, I think it's Sterling Hayden, in a barnstorming performance, it starts to leave Chandler behind.
Yeah.
And from memory, I don't think there's any of Chandler's dialogue in it.
I'm not sure. No.
I'm not sure. Nobody must hold me to that because I'm not sure, but I don't think there is. But what really, a film critic, Roger Ebert said that Marlowe of The Long Goodbye, of Altman's Long Goodbye, is the man from Honor from 1953 who is lost in the hazy narcissism of 1973. And that is absolutely right. I think that is absolutely right. He seems so out of place.
Yes.
I agree that what Elliot Gould does with Marlowe is very good in the situation that Marlowe finds himself in. And very famously, they called him Rip Van Marlowe because they said it's as if he's been asleep for 40 years, 30 years, and has just woken up, sort of thing.
Yes.
But all it does for me is emphasize how out of place he is as a character in his own story.
Yes.
That there is a very shocking and brutal scene with a Coke bottle, which seems to me to be so 1970s that it just makes everything about Marlowe pointless somehow. The ending, Marlowe does something at the end which you either think he would or he wouldn't, and I'm never sure how I feel about that. I think once I've accepted that this is not a straight adaptation of a Chandler novel, I think, well, you're free to do anything you want. So in the context of these 2 hours, I can buy into that. But then I then think to myself, well, if you're going to take the character out of his time and place, you've got to make sure he's the same man that I know and love.
Yes.
And that isn't him. So what's the point of calling him Marlowe? Why don't you just call him Joe Schmo? yeah. So I think it's good, but I think it's too obviously a 1970s film.
Yeah. So do you think that the problem is it that a character, particularly a character like Philip Marlowe, are they transferable to different points in time in the way that someone like Sherlock Holmes seems to be able to slip through time for various reasons? Is it that Marlowe maybe just can't do that, and the maybe the biggest drawback of The Long Goodbye was that it just shouldn't have been a Marlowe adaptation. They just should have done if they had done a 1970s response to hard-boiled fiction film noir, as opposed to sort of this depressingly grunge.
Yes, I think if you look at a film like Clute with Donald Sutherland and Jane Fonda, that's a contemporary private eye film, and it works perfectly well.
Yeah,
you can see where you know who its grandparents were in cinematic terms. You know which films have given rise to it, and you know what literature's given rise to it. I don't think you need, but it doesn't need to be Philip Marlowe for it to work.
Yeah, correct.
As a private eye story, and films. I mean, there's a Paul Newman version of the Arch novels, and Harper.
Yes, Harper. Yes.
And I've not seen that for years and years, but I don't remember thinking that was out of place.
No, I loved it. It's fun.
I think it is a sense that there are some characters that can shift in time, and Holmes does appear to be one. Not just the Cumberbatch series. But I mean, the Basil Rathbone films predominantly were in contemporary times. But before Basil Rathbone did The Hound of the Baskervilles, all the Sherlock Holmes films were set in contemporary times. The Eileen Orwell Silence were in the 20s. Arthur Wantner was in the 30s.
Yeah.
But I think Marlowe belongs to a very specific time and place.
Yeah.
And I think that if any proof is needed for that, I think you only have to look at the 1978 Big Sleep from Michael Winner.
That's
which transposes him not only to 1978 but also to London. So he's wrong place and wrong time.
Correct. Yeah.
And it's pretty woeful. I mean, the best thing about that version is Mitchum himself. But he's nowhere near as good in that as he was in
Farewell, My Lovely.
Farewell, My Lovely from 3 years before, when he's playing. He's an older Marlowe, but he's in the 1940s, and I think he's constantly talking about Joe DiMaggio, and I don't know anything about baseball, but that pinpoints the year apparently. It's the year Joe DiMaggio broke some record or whatever it is. Yeah. So he's an older Marlowe, and it fits him extremely well. And I go so far as to say he's, if not my favourite, then certainly my second favourite Marlowe on screen.
And who would be your first? Is it
Dick Powell?
Dick Powell? Yeah, I was going to say I love Dick Powell as Marlowe.
And before any Bogart fans jump on me, I think Bogart was such an established star in that sort of film that it's hard to take him. You say, well, that's Bogart playing Philip Marlowe. Yes. Dick Powell was a song and dance man and a light comedian.
Yes.
Which is why they had to make it Murder My Sweet and not Farewell, My Lovely, because they all thought that people would think that was a Dick Powell musical.
Yes. Dick Powell is what Michael Keaton is to Batman.
Absolutely right. That's absolutely right. Yes, it is. It is. That is absolutely right. Everyone sneered at it. Everyone said this is never going to work. Yeah. And then what he did was say, "Well, I am going to make this role my own." And and you can see Dick Powell is acting the screen off.
He does,
and he's very good. And my criticism about Fred McMurray speaking Chandler's lines does not apply to Dick Powell. He says it somehow. He says it as if he's just thought of them.
Yes,
it's a very great performance.
Yeah.
But to go back to the Mitchum Big Sleep is proof that Marlowe needs to stay in the early 40s, late 40s, the early 50s at the latest, and leave him be in Los Angeles. He doesn't need to come to London.
No, I completely agree.
It just doesn't work. No. It doesn't work.
There's a crime fiction academic out there who wrote a really, really interesting book kind of about this stuff, and essentially what she's saying is that each hard-boiled detective is responding to the time that he is in. Spade and Constantinople are very much responding to the disenchantment of life after the First World War. the Marlowes are kind of post-depression or depression stroke post-World War II stuff. Again, Ross MacDonald is late 50s into the 60s, which is a very, he's responding to sexual revolution. He's responding to the growth of psychology, things like that. Again, you move forward with Robert B. Parker, who is exploring things in the 80s and 90s, from AIDS to feminism to abortion, all that kind of stuff. I think that is partly why both The Long Goodbye and The Big Sleep that are modernized really, really don't work, because the Marlowe that they are using belongs in another time.
That's right.
And I think, I hate to say, but even the Joe Ide book, the new that came out, that he wrote like a updated Marlowe prequel, where it's like Marlowe before he's Marlowe, and I mean it's not written in the first person, which if you read Philip Raymond Chandler, it's first person past tense always. This is weirdly third person, and it's not Marlowe. It just isn't.
No,
it just isn't Marlowe.
It can't be, if it's not in the first person. It can't. It's never gonna. No. It's never gonna be Marlowe. And and I say that the other way around as well, because I've just written a private eye novel, and one of the first things I did, I don't know about yours, one of the first things I thought to myself was, it's set just after the Second World War, and I thought, so this is Marlowe time, except I'm in London, my character's in London.
Yeah.
One of the first things I said to myself was, if you put this in the first person, you are automatically setting yourself up to fail, because the temptation to try and write like he does, and the inevitable comparison will be tenfold, and you will come out worse. So I did it in the third person. So because I think that the first person private eye novel, unless you're really brave, you're setting yourself up for a fall. And
yikes.
You know what I mean? Oh, have you done it in the first? Oh, you are brave.
Yeah, man. I'm in it.
Maybe that's the right thing to do, and I'm just a coward. I don't know, but it's the maybe it's my temptation would be too great to try and put some of those similes in.
Sure.
Because it's such a style.
Yes.
Such an indelible style.
I mean, when I think about the history of noir in novels, I mean, they're all first person. Whether that's Marlowe, Lou Archer, Spencer, Sarah, V.I. Wysarski, like they're all first person stuff. So I think it's finding a way of and they all really build off of each other. They all build off of the foundation of Chandler and Spade. Or
you have to find your own voice, certainly. But maybe I just felt that I would get lost in the chat, because Chandler's one of my favorites. I go back to him regularly. He's almost like never out of your head, And some people have done continuation novels, which in my day were called pastiches. But they never quite get it. They're never quite as good,
No.
But so the point being that I think Marlowe is one of those detectives who has to be in that time and place, and I think Sam Spade has to be in the late 20s, early 30s.
Yes,
in San Francisco. I don't think he would work anywhere else.
No. So I think the other thing that is kind of maybe not as obvious, but would be missing is, and this goes back to the femme fatale, and what is the femme fatale? The femme fatale is that particular point in time that literature responding to the kind of the rise of feminism, the rise of women having way more freedom, the rise of that kind of that sort of stuff, where it's like, well, no, like, they, a woman doesn't have to be sitting at home, like, they can be, free, and they can be they have the ability to go out and be their own individual, and that can sometimes be dangerous. And the femme fatale almost in some way, especially in Chandler's books, represents a sort of fear of what the woman is capable of achieving.
Absolutely. And the best femme fatales show that women aren't damsels in distress, ready to be saved.
Yeah,
they are. I mean, they often say, "Well, she's not the damsel; she's the villain." Then, But the best ones are a sort of they're much more nuanced than that. They're much more nuanced than that. The femme fatale in Double Indemnity, I think, is particularly nuanced because you can relate to a woman who is trapped in a relationship she can't get out of.
Yeah.
And Bridget O'Shaughnessy is a woman who was given all these men. I mean, how many? She's surrounded by the fat man, Joel Cairo. What's he called? Thursby,
yes.
She's Anne Spade, and she plays them all.
Yes.
And she is the cleverest character in the book, as far as I can see, and in the film. And she knows when to turn the tears on. She knows when to be tough.
Yes.
And she's a really, really strong female character in quite an early crime novel.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, Luke, go on.
Oh, no, carry on. It's fine.
Well, I just wanted to, going back to The Long Goodbye, and to a lesser extent, The Big Sleep, but certainly The Long Goodbye. I think this, because there's no coincidence, I don't think, that and Chinatown, which came out a year after, are in the 70s. Because, I mean, you're talking then, like, Watergate's happened. The audience, I think, both reading and cinematic, are probably a lot more cynical than they were 10 years prior, 20 years prior.
Yeah.
So if you just remade one of these films, in the 70s, and set it in the 40s, I don't think it would necessarily succeed.
Yeah.
And I just want to mention Chinatown, if I may, very quickly.
Yes.
Because it's my favourite film of all time. And that ostensibly does exactly that. It essentially says we're going to make it's set in 1938, I think. We're going to make a PI neo-noir detective film for the 70s. So because it's a much more paranoid age, and it was a more paranoid age, what's at the heart of it is much darker.
Yeah.
What Jack Nicholson's character, and the role was written for Jack Nicholson, what he uncovers is so sort of intricate and not only political but also deeply personal. Yeah. Not a single person is unaffected by it, And so what the film does is say everything we've just been talking about. You can't take the private eye necessarily into the 70s and make him work. So what we'll do is we'll put him in the Chandler era. We'll make him almost like a Chandler PI and a Spade character.
Yeah.
But we will give him problems that we know about in the 70s. Yeah. Yeah. So it speaks to both sides. That's what's so clever about it. And there are several directorial choices which are great. Nicholson's in every scene, and a lot of it is shot over his shoulder. And he, as they all do, he gets knocked out, and the camera goes out of focus, then goes black, and then reverses as he wakes up. Yeah. And if that's not a cinematic way of saying this is a Raymond Chandler first-person narration, I don't know what it is. Yeah. Yeah. But he's subtly different to Marlowe. He's very fond of his appearance, and he's quite wealthy. Not wealthy in the sense he's posh, but his office, his business is clearly doing well. Right. He has a secretary and he has 2 associates, and so he's not quite the Raymond Chandler PI. Yeah, his business is obviously doing well, but he's a nice underneath it all, you get the impression that whilst he can be tough,
yeah,
he doesn't really wisecrack, and he's not really. He's much more sensitive.
Mm.
And when you find out why it's called Chinatown, it's a really sort of heart-wrenching moment.
right, yeah,
So I think that's a way of. So where The Long Goodbye fails, by making it a 70s film, but with a recognised 40s and 50s character, Chinatown succeeds by doing almost the opposite.
Yeah.
It stays to the time and the place, but it introduces much more contemporary and thought-provoking themes for a 70s audience.
Yeah, I think that's the mark of good historical fiction in general, really.
It is, it is. I mean,
when you do that,
when you write golden age stories now, as I do, it's not enough these days, to say, oh right, well the butler did it, and he's now been carried off to prison, and he's going to be hanged. So we'll all have to, we'll all have a nice muffin, because life goes on. These people they've had their darkest secrets exposed. They might have discovered things about each other they don't like. Their relationships will change. And you, as a writer now, you have to carry that on. And you have to demonstrate that. Whereas Christie didn't,
Yes. So it's interesting, really, that even now, modern day cozy stroke, golden agey kind of stuff is also feeling a sort of maybe an impact of noir fiction.
Yeah, because it has to keep up. It can't just be tea and muffins and body in the garden, because no one now does that anymore. I mean, I suppose there are people who write that, and they may be very successful, but the cozies that I write and the cozies that I like to read that are written by modern writers, I mean, Martin Edwards is a great example.
Yes,
they are noir influenced in the sense that people are acting for genuine reasons. They are real people. It's just that they happen to be in a fictional, artificial construct.
Yes,
and I think that's what Chinatown does. That it sows the seeds for those sorts of books that say, and films that say, this is something from the past, but it's relevant to you today, sitting in the movie theatre in 1974. And that's what The Long Goodbye pointedly fails to do for me.
Yeah. And I think I want to cap this conversation off with a brief chat about Poodle Springs.
Right.
Because again, Poodle Springs is it was an unfinished novel by Raymond Chandler that Robert B. Parker, who wrote Spencer novels, completed and then was adapted into a TV movie in 1998. So for all intents and purposes, this is technically a historical fiction movie, right?
Yeah.
And kind of going off what you were saying regarding Chinatown being historical fiction and being set in 1938, but having commentary that is reflective of what audiences in the 70s would relate to and understand. I mean, I would say Poodle Springs does not do that.
No.
In the slightest.
I call Poodle Springs Marlowe Light.
Yes,
I think James Caan does a pretty good job. It's 95 minutes, and I think you're entertained for 93 of them. I think it's an enjoyable film, and I think it's important to remember it's a TV movie. And
I didn't realize
it comes with all the problems of a TV movie.
Correct. I didn't know this. I put the disc in and hit play, and then HBO popped up, and that's like, this wasn't a real movie. This was a TV movie. Which you wouldn't say that today. If you think about Netflix and HBO and all that kind of stuff that they produce now, everything is movie quality. But a TV movie in the mid or the late 90s is a very different beast.
And I reckon the chances are that most of the budget went on James Caan.
Yeah, my initial reaction to when it kicked off, I was like, this is hokey. This is a little bit... It had a cheap vibe to it. But then I was like, but this is also a TV movie. Yeah. So that doesn't... I don't want to necessarily hold that against it. What I do... James Caan was decent, but he was really one note.
Yeah.
Except for the cat scene.
Yes.
That's the only moment where he's not.
Well,
and I'm like,
it's straight after the cat scene that he gives the line that I mentioned earlier about
yes,
this is a lonely man's job.
yes,
and I'm not that man anymore.
Yes.
And that's the shock that he's had. Yeah.
Yes. And there are several really great lines in this movie. I think there were I wrote down a good few one-liners that I really liked. Like one was when he's with Laura at her house, and the assistant to her dad is, babbling on about something, and he just says, "You can call me Santa Claus if it'll get you to the point."
Yes.
And I love that. And there's another line that I think was Laura's line where she says, "There's no such thing as a clean dollar." Like, there's these really great moments, these really great lines that could speak to a wider social problem, even though it's 1950s, that could be reflecting in the 1990s, but it doesn't really quite land with me in general, because the film tries to demonstrate an us versus them kind of situation where Marlowe is the us and Laura and her life is the them, and
Yes.
he doesn't fit in. I mean, again, the other great line is when he's like, "You call the president Jack?"
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, all this stuff is kind of nicely set up, but then it just doesn't get explored well enough throughout the course of it.
No, and there's a very I won't say too much because you've yet to watch Chinatown, Luke, so I won't say too much. But I get the impression that somebody somewhere had watched Chinatown recently, and that resulted in there is a similar plot point, and it results in perhaps a twist too far in Poodle Springs, and it makes me think that the ending might be. I think the script probably ended 10 minutes before the film does.
Yes, absolutely.
There is something tagged on to the end of it, which it's not necessarily the point of Chinatown, but it has echoes, and because it's so obvious, but not done as well, it really does jar. It really does jar.
I don't know if this is it. Don't tell me, but I'm assuming you're referencing the twist at the end that it is Laura and her father that are also connected to all of the nonsense.
Sort of, yeah. When you've watched Chinatown, we'll have a Zoom meeting and we'll talk about it.
Okay, sounds good.
But yeah, I accept all of that.
Yeah,
and yet I would quite happily sit if there was nothing on TV. You're done writing for the day. You don't really want to go and read. I would quite happily, in the right frame of mind, put Poodle Springs on and know I was going to have a good time for an hour and a half. I don't expect too much of it.
Yeah.
It doesn't give me too much. It just gives me an hour and a half of easy watching.
Yeah.
Whereas the big hitters that we've talked about, they really are a sort of not a commitment, but you really got to invest in those.
Yes.
Poodle Springs is like MTV Chandler. It's sort of it's almost there, but it's not quite there. Do you know what I mean?
I think one of the other disappointing aspects of it is the fact that Marlowe is in this completely new situation. Particularly, he's married, and the exploration of this loner guy finally being married. Again, that was just kind of lazily explored. And I also, in addition to that, it's lazily explored because the character of Laura, she's really just a gag to get him out of jail.
Yes, she is.
Like 5 times.
Yes, she is.
And it's frustrating because, like, if she's meant to be a lawyer, I'm like, this seems like a really thinking about Spencer and how his Susan Silverman is his girlfriend, but she's also a psychologist, and that links up sometimes with Spencer's case or his problems or something like that. And I thought, will they do? Nope.
Yeah, you're right. She's a plot device to show that Marlowe's a fish out of water.
Yeah.
And really, we know that. We know that
Yes.
from...
Yes.
That is explained far better and demonstrated far better in the build-up to the move to Poodle Springs, where it's always a possibility that it will happen, whether he likes it or not.
Yeah.
And he's almost got no say in it.
Yeah.
And once he's there, he has to make the best of a bad job.
Yeah.
But you're right. They pick up that ball, but just sort of drop it, and they never really run with it. They don't see where they can go with that, and it could have been quite interesting. Instead, they opt for rather too much deception upon deception.
Yes.
Which he's investigating one mystery that then seems to be something else, which is, we've said before, was a good thing about these sorts of films and these sorts of books, but it's not handled particularly well in Poodle Springs, because it's almost got to the end of its running time before that happens.
Yes. Oh, yes. It's tripping over itself to get to the end.
It is, sure. Yeah, it is. It's as if they suddenly thought, oh my God, we've only got 10 minutes left of screen time and we've not even got to the main plot. Quick, we'll wrap it up quick, But like I say, I bear it no ill will.
True. Yeah. Yeah.
I think I would put it on with much more readily than I would put The Long Goodbye on. I'd have to be in the mood to watch.
Oh God, yeah, definitely not.
I'd really have to want to watch The Long Goodbye to put it on.
Yes.
Although having said that, I might put it on this weekend and just see if we've been fair to it.
There have been times in the past where I've maybe I'll just give it a go, and then 20 minutes in, I'm like, I gotta go. I gotta do something else.
It's a strange film. It's a strange film.
Yeah. But film noir fiction. For me, it is the playground that I love to be in. There's really there's no other kind of type of fiction that I really would rather write than that, which is why the research I'm doing for the PhD is all kind of on that. My novel is very, very much a hard-boiled novel, but subverts a few things in a very minor way that make it quite fun, I think. And that is kind of picking up, basically transposing the American hard-boiled novel and dropping him into a very different world than what he's used to. So I love it. I love the way that it's is able to like we were saying with the Glass Key and The Big Sleep and all these films that are able to kind of do something a little bit more in terms of what their social commentary is about the time in which they're created, but then how we can kind of look back at that now and and see the hindsight of everything as well. To me, it's one of there's a reason why, as you were saying earlier, noir just sort of continues. It doesn't really dip, and its influences are everywhere.
Crime fiction generally doesn't dip in popularity. It remains the most popular genre of all. And certain, it can do a lot of things. So, but the noir elements of it, and by that I mean where it's talking about actual issues and human emotions and right and wrong not necessarily winning one way or the other, or the motives not quite being as straightforward as you might want them to be. Things like that. The moral ambiguity of film noir is a constant, and it's a constant because it's constant in human beings.
That's life.
It's life. Yeah, that's life. So whilst that doesn't take away from Golden Age fiction, it doesn't take away from spy fiction, it doesn't take away from any other type of crime fiction or thriller fiction, because each does its own thing. But noir essentially is the closest I think we get to how the world is.
Yes. Yeah. I think because I remember once being scolded by by one of my supervisors for making the claim that Chandler and those guys are kind of reaching for realism, and they were like, "This is not realism." Blah 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 blah. Henry James is realism, and I was like, "Oh God."
I disagree with that entirely.
I do, and so then I've repositioned as like, fine, if you're gonna be like that pedantic, we'll go with plausibility. The crimes, the situations, the reactions, all of this stuff is plausible. You could plausibly read about any of these crimes in the newspaper tomorrow. Is there a hyper sense of reality in the novels? Yes, but it's the plausibility factor that I think connects with people. And that's what Chandler meant by Dashiell Hammett gives murder back to the kind of people who commit it for reasons.
That's exactly what he means. That's exactly what he means. And murder is nasty. And also, in this type of literature and film, there is very often more than one killer.
Yep.
Because not more than one person has a reason to kill another person.
Yeah.
In these stories. It's very rare. I mean, it does happen, but it's very rare in Golden Age, for example, since that's what we've been contrasting with, for there to be two killers.
Yeah.
It's very rare. It does happen, but it doesn't happen anywhere near as much.
You get the implausible Murder on the Orient Express, where they're all the killer.
Well, I mean, I think Chandler said about that. It's a solution so ridiculous that only a half-wit would guess it. And I sort of have sympathy with that. That's not my favorite Christie of all, I'm afraid. But
no. Biffer in the chat asks, "What's the best foreign film noir film?" Don't know. It's a good question. Should have thought about this.
We should have thought about this. Yeah. That's really tough. That's really tough. We'd have to give that some thought, I think.
I would too, because I'm unfortunately I can't say. Biffer, what would be your best foreign film noir film? Because then we can go off of that. But because that is quite hard to pinpoint. And also, what does foreign mean? Because there's probably some decent British ones, but British from an American perspective.
I mean, one that does spring to my mind, Fritz Lang's M. may not be classed as film noir as such, but it seems to me that that's got a lot of what film noir later hijacks as its tropes.
Yeah,
it's certainly morally ambiguous.
Yeah,
it's shot in shadow. And I remember once hearing a film critic say that film noir is it starts in shadow and they bring the light in as little light as possible so you can see what's going on. Whereas ordinarily you talk about a film set being lit, so noir starts in the shadows. And I think M is certainly shot like that. And the protagonist is very clearly not a hero. He's quite the opposite.
Yes.
He's a child murderer. And he's put on trial by other criminals. And the theme then becomes, the moral question then becomes, are some criminals better than others? Because if we're not, what right have you got to try me? And the police are quite happy for this trial to go ahead. I mean, that seems to me to be sowing seeds of what film noir will later become.
Yes.
And off the top of my head, I think I would say that is certainly one that should be taken into account. Yeah.
You know what? One that's popped in, one that is trying to get to the front of my mind is a Japanese film. Help me out. What's the film that inspired George Lucas?
Seven Samurai.
Seven Samurai. That it's that guy. He did. There's a noir film around that time, around the 40s, and I watched it like 6 months ago, and it was great. But now I can't remember the name of it, and that was really.
I know which one you mean as well. Because is the plot not similar to Red Harvest?
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can find it. Biffer in the chat says that Black Coal Thin Ice 2014, a Chinese noir, and Elevator to the Gallows, a French neo-noir. High and Low, he says High and Low. Yeah, I think that might be the name of the movie that I'm thinking of. High and Low.
Elevator to the Gallows sounds like a great one. I will look that up.
Yes, that is it. Biffer's right. High and Low. That is that's the one. It's great. That is a terrific Japanese film noir movie. Highly.
That's not one I know. So the two films for me to look out for now. Yeah,
go check that one out. That's the one I watched relatively recently, and it was terrific. It's wonderful.
We've concentrated on American films, but I think we ought to really, apart from the 1978 Big Sleep, there are some really good British film noirs.
Yes,
things like The Third Man.
Oh yes, of course. Yeah.
Brighton Rock, which, again, they are shot. I mean, The Third Man particularly. It's impossible not to say that that's a film noir. But Brighton Rock certainly holds its own in terms of how it's shot, and the moral ambiguity, and the fact that it's a gang of criminals who you are sympathizing with.
Yeah.
And you are identifying with. Because that's what film noir does. Perversely, for films that are largely shot in black and white, the worlds they show you are anything but black and white.
Yes,
there are very grey moral areas to be addressed here, and Brighton Rock is certainly one of those. So, depending where you are in the world, I would say that Brighton Rock and The Third Man are perhaps two very good foreign film noirs.
Yeah.
Although I appreciate I'm playing a trick with the word foreign.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean this, I guess the point of this is when it comes to noir, it really is birthed out of American crime fiction, which is the Chandler and the Dashiell Hammett, which is kind of the theme of tonight. But no, we could do a whole nother episode.
We could. We could do a whole other section on Neo-Noir. I mean,
oh yes, it will be done.
Said for films like Seven, Shutter Island.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, I want to. Yeah,
the Dirty Harry, the early Dirty Harry films, Magnum Force certainly, and I think it's a film noir. Yeah, there's a whole load of neo noirs and modern noirs that we could. Well, I mean, LA Confidential is a superb film. A superb film. The Usual Suspects. I count all those as noir films.
Yes. Yeah.
Which shows just what an influential genre it is. Well, an influential type of crime story it is. Like I said, I think of it more as a mood and a style rather than a genre in its own right. But it's certainly popular and it is certainly influential to this day.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, I think we'll wrap this up because this was good fun, Matt.
Yeah, it was good fun.
Give a shout out to. Say again.
I just thank people for the comments.
Oh yes, indeed. Thank you, Biffer and Lena and Karen, who's my mom. Barry, Phil, all of you for joining in. We're back next week. Next week, I believe, is our 007 show. I think we're going to be talking about James Bond. But let me tell you for sure, because I feel like I should be clear on this. Next week we have another author joining us, AJ Black. He's just written a book all about the history of Sean Connery. Looks really great. Go check it out. But next week we're talking about James Bond, the kind of the past, the present, and the future of this particular character on film, and what we hope to see, what we might not want to see, all sorts of speculations and comments, looking at what the Broccoli's have said in the press recently, and all that kind of stuff. It's going to be a lot of fun, so tune in. Other than that, yeah. Matthew, give a shout out to some of your books and where people can find you on social media and things like that.
I'm on Twitter as @HolmesBooth. Just search my name, you'll find me.
Holmes as in Sherlock Holmes, right?
As in Sherlock Holmes, yeah. Instagram as Mathew Booth author. I've got my first Everett Carr novel, which is the Golden Age novel, is called A Talent for Murder. That's out now. The sequel is out in January, called The Dangers of This Night. And the third one will be out January 2024, which is called, at the minute, A Killing Amongst the Dead.
Epic.
Those are the Everett Carr mysteries, and as I say, I'm hoping there's going to be a Private Eye novel out sometime soon, but I'll keep you posted on that.
Nice. We look forward to it. There will be a link.
All available from Amazon, by the way. Just to
yes, there will be a link to your books in the description below for anyone who's not watching live or whatnot. And also make sure to like and subscribe, because that helps keep us going. But anyway, we will see everyone next week. Bye.
That's great. And thank you very much, Luke, for your invitation. I enjoyed it.
You're welcome.